The uptick of violence continues on the Israel-Gaza border as IDF airstrikes hit 2 Hamas posts following 3 rockets, which were today fired from Gaza into Israeli territory. We'll be live with our correspondent where one of those rockets landed. A controversial camera bill to allow surveillance in polling booths at next week's Israeli elections fails in its first hearing at the Israeli parliament. We'll take you live to Jerusalem. And emotional memorial services happening today in the United States as the world remembers one of the most world-changing events in modern history, 18 years on from September 11, 2001. Hello, I'm Sarah Coates. Thanks for joining me. We begin in the region, and tensions on the Israel-Gaza border continue to escalate with 3 rockets fired from the Gaza Strip into Israeli territory today, the second such incident in as many days. In response, the IDF striking 2 Hamas posts in northern Gaza. Now, one of the projectiles hit a home on the Israeli side of the border, while the other 2 landed in open areas with no injuries reported. The Israel Defense Forces responding with a tank opening fire on 2 Hamas posts in the Strip. Palestinian media is reporting that several Palestinians have been injured by Israel's response, although the Gaza Health Ministry is contradicting those reports, saying that nobody was hurt. And let's go now to our correspondent Pierre Chandler, who is standing by in an Israeli community on the Israel-Gaza border. Pierre, thanks so much for joining me. You are there at one of those homes which was damaged. Tell me, what are you hearing from the residents there? It's the second time in as many days that they've been sent running to shelters. Tell me, how concerned are they that this might escalate further?
Right, Sarah, I'm going to just show you the impact of the rocket or the mortar fire that crashed here in the courtyard of this house. You can see the impact, and that's not big, but you must understand that the distance from here to the Gaza Strip is about a mile away from here, and it takes seconds, literally seconds, for this rocket to be launched and to be crushing here. Luckily, none of the inhabitants of the house behind me were present at the time of the landing of the rocket. Now, I'm going to show you some of the impacts of this rocket. The shrapnels you can see on the roof of this shelter for cars where the Rosen family usually park the car. And now, I'll show you now, this is about, let's say, 7, maybe 20 feet away from the house. And this is the house. You see TV crews are here, just like us. There's a hole in the window of this house, a hole of one of the shrapnels that landed inside the living room of that family. Again, this family is protected. They have a protected room in the house, and they can run into that shelter, that private shelter. But none of the people were here. It's a family of 3 kids. The wife and the husband were working. They rushed to the house, learning that their house was minorly damaged. But this is the kind of reality that the inhabitants of the communities around the Gaza Strip are living daily for 19 years, basically, but even more, though, for the past year and a half. Now, the residents are enduring that with quite a lot of patience, I must say. They say that it's lovely to live here. They like to live here. They wouldn't consider a second leaving their homes. But yet, it is a very difficult reality. And for the past 3 weeks, only the past 3 weeks, 23 rocket launches and landing were counted by the IDF.
Pierre, certainly a terrifying time for residents there on the border. Really appreciate the update, and I'll come back to you a little later on in the evening. Meanwhile, strong condemnation is coming in today from the European Union over Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's plan to annex the Jordan Valley in the West Bank if he secures the country's top job following next week's elections. Now, the EU releasing a statement saying the policy of settlement construction and expansion is illegal under international law, and its continuation and actions taken in this context undermine the viability of the two-state solution and and the prospects for lasting peace. Now, the EU is not the only organisation slamming Netanyahu's plan, with Palestinian officials, along with Saudi Arabia, Jordan and Turkey, also joining in, saying such a move would kill the chances for a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Here's the United Nations Secretary General spokesperson.
Unilateral actions are not helpful in the peace process. Our position today is unchanged and is reflected in relevant UN resolutions. Any Israeli decision to impose its laws, jurisdiction, and administration in the occupied West Bank is without any international legal effect. I think such a prospect would be devastating to the potential of reviving negotiations, regional peace, and the very essence of a two-state solution.
There's been another abrupt announcement from US President Donald Trump, with the US leader announcing that his hawkish national security advisor, John Bolton, is out of the administration. It's been reported that the two had strong disagreements on Iran, Afghanistan and a number of other global challenges. So, what does his departure mean for Israel? Our correspondent Jonathan Regev reports.
The now former National Security Advisor John Bolton might have been a controversial figure in Washington, but there was one place where he was always welcome.
I'm delighted to be in Israel once again and look forward to our coming discussions. Thank you.
The hardline rhetoric coming from the former American UN ambassador was music to the ears of those hosting him at the Prime Minister's office in Jerusalem.
Sanctions are biting, and more added last night. Iran can never have nuclear weapons.
Bolton was constantly pushing the U.S. administration for tougher sanctions on Iran, suggesting a possible military strike on the Islamic Republic. But it was not the only issue where he saw eye to eye with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
John, as you can see, the Jordan Valley offers Israel the minimal strategic depth and strategic height for the defense of our country.
2.5 months before announcing his plans to annex the area, Netanyahu took Bolton to the Jordan Valley.
I just think it's too bad, Prime Minister, that more Americans can't come to locations like this, see the geography, understand its significance, understand how it affects Israel's critical security position, and explain why Israel's taken the view that it has.
The U.S. National Security Advisor is now gone, just a week before Israelis head to the polls once again. Who will be appointed Bolton's successor, and who might be the next Israeli Prime Minister to meet him? We will find out soon enough.
And for more on this story, let's bring in our correspondent, Jordana Miller, who joins me here in the studio. Jordana, thank you for joining me. This is a real loss for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Tell me, are we hearing anything from him yet?
We are not hearing anything from his office, and from what I understand from sources in the Prime Minister's office, we won't hear anything. This is a devastating loss for the Israeli Prime Minister. Remember, he shared Netanyahu's hawkish stance and policies on Iran, which include, of course, maximum pressure on the Iranians, sanctions. We will remember that back in June, when the Iranians downed an American drone, the president pulled back and did not carry out, the American president, a retaliatory strike. Bolton was said to be one of those who believed that was a huge mistake. Bolton, many people believed, was somewhat on the war path between the United States and Iran. Now, not that Israel would be pushing for any kind of war in the region, but should conflict break out, certainly Israel would prefer to have the United States taking the lead on that. So this is a loss for the Prime Minister, no doubt.
It certainly is. Jordana Miller, stay with me. I'll come back to you a little later on. But we are going out for a short break. When we come back, 18 years on from this horrific terror attack, which killed thousands of people as planes flew into the Twin Towers. We'll go live to New York as a number of ceremonies are being held around the US to mark that fateful day that changed the world as we know it. All of that, plenty more when we come back. Stay with us.
unflinching, outspoken, and to the point. The most complete coverage of the day's events. Weeknights, watch Crossroads for analysis, interviews, and reporting that connects us to the Middle East and the world. Watch Crossroads, 6 p.m. Eastern, only on I-24 News.
On Stateside, it's not just about delivering the news. It's about giving meaning to the news and doing so with clarity.
These families waiting to get into the country, how long will they be in detention?
What happens around the rest of the world can have a huge impact on the United States. And what happens in the United States can have a huge impact on the rest of the world. That's Stateside.
The power of creativity, the effects of technology, the development of entrepreneurship. Israel Business Weekly connects you to the story like no one else. Tune in for a journey around the world to find the inventors and technologies shaping our future. Watch Israel Business Weekly every Sunday evening at 9 p.m. Eastern, only on I-24 News.
In less than a week, Israelis return to the polls, and the stakes are high. Join us on the rundown to hear from Aryeh Deri, leader of the influential ultra-Orthodox Shas party, who's campaigning hand-in-hand with Benjamin Netanyahu. Could his bear hug harm the prime minister on Election Day? Only on I-24 News at 8 p.m. Israel, 1 p.m. Eastern Time.
I-24 News, the international channel in the heart of the Middle East, now brings you a new view of this troubled region. From I-24 News' acclaimed Arabic language channel, the stories, the people, the passions of the Middle East that you haven't seen before. A weekly roundup of highlights from I-24 News Arabic. Every Sunday, only on I-24 News.
Thanks for staying with us. Now, today, September 11, marks 18 years since the attacks on the United States, that fateful day back in 2001. Memorial ceremonies are happening at the sites of the attacks, with new plaques and monuments erected and moments of silence to mourn the 2,983 people who died in those attacks. Now, the new memorials include massive granite slabs outside the World Trade Center. President Donald Trump taking part in the Pentagon observance ceremony in Arlington, Virginia, and will also hold a moment of silence at the White House. Here's Trump speaking a little earlier.
If for any reason they come back to our country, we will go wherever they are and use power the likes of which the United States has never used before. And I'm not even talking about nuclear power. They will never have seen anything like what will happen to them. No enemy on earth can match the overwhelming strength, skill, and might of the American armed forces.
And for more, let's now go to our correspondent, Ariel Hickson, who is standing by at Ground Zero in New York. Ariel, thank you so much for joining me. This date is marked every year. Tell me, what is new this year around?
Absolutely. It's a somber day here in New York. I'm right downtown New York. You can see right here behind me the World Trade Center. Now, just under 3,000 names are set to be read this morning, but something that is new this year is that there will be some concrete slabs detailing the names of those who died due to respiratory illnesses, cancers, a bunch of first responders who were there during that time who are still feeling the negative effects of 9/11. So there is a lot of focus on not only remembering the past, but looking towards the future and looking towards how this still affects us to this day. Also, Governor Cuomo enacted a national day where we really focus on 9/11, where a bunch of public school students will have a moment of silence going forward to really remember this day. So again, looking towards the past, but also trying to establish a legacy for 9/11 towards the future.
Ariel Hickson there in New York, thanks for the update. Let's bring Jordana Miller back in now. Jordana, you were actually there on the ground covering this terrible, terrible terror attack. It's now 18 years on, and I really don't think anybody can forget where they were or forget these pictures the first time they saw them. Tell me, what exactly was it like on the ground when you were covering this story?
I mean, this is one of those experiences, I think, that you just don't forget as a journalist. First of all, I was fortunate enough to be one of just a few dozen people who actually made it into CNN's offices that day. I happened to be up very early. I heard the news. I got on the subway, and I made it to the office, but before the second plane crashed into the Twin Tower. And it was, you know, a terrifying day. I can tell you that CNN has very complicated or complex intercom systems, and we were hearing all kinds of information that we couldn't report right away, like the president who'd been moved to a secret location, the vice president moving, the fact that there were other planes in the air, we didn't know where they were going. This was all terrifying. And then I was there to see some of the first images that came out of the Associated Press hours later, where it literally looked like a Holocaust had, you know, the after effects of a nuclear bomb had gone off with the white dust and the dazed people and just the shock. And I, at that time, had been working on a story with Howard Lutnick, who nobody knew at the time. He ran Cantor Fitzgerald, a bond trade business. And he suddenly shot to fame in the United States because the plane hit right one floor above his office. He lost 530-something employees, including his brother, who I knew, who I had spent time filming with, including my counterpart on the ground. I was doing a profile piece, a 30-minute profile piece, really, on Howard Lutnick. And suddenly, you know, I saw those images and I thought, Howard's got to be dead. I mean, this is crazy. When you've been up in those offices, I still keep the card that I used, you know, to get in and out of the World Trade Center. Thankfully, because Howard took his young son to school that day, he survived. And he went back and tried to help everybody, and now everybody knows Howard Lutnick has gone over the line, really, in raising millions of dollars to take care of those families. But this was a story that unfolded over months, and I was fortunate enough to be at CNN in the months ahead working on the morning show that was a 5-hour show. Everybody who was anyway connected to that story came through our green room and was on the shows there, and it was one of the most you know, painful and, on the other hand, educating experiences as a journalist.
Certainly, and I'll never forget seeing those pictures and hearing when it happened. Jordana Miller, thank you so much for that.
Thanks.
Let's go now to Israeli politics, and a controversial bill proposed by Benjamin Netanyahu has failed in its first reading at the Israeli parliament. Lawmakers voting against the camera bill, which would have allowed cameras into polling booths during Israel's next election happening next week, September 17. Now, the bill, which was proposed by the ruling Likud party, was unable to garner the 61 votes it needed to pass into law. And let's go now to our senior international affairs correspondent, Owen Alterman, who is standing by at the Israeli parliament there. Owen, nice to have you on. Firstly, tell me what stood out from today's debate and vote there.
Well, Sarah, the vote was known in advance. Again, Avigdor Lieberman and his Israel Beitenu party announced ahead of time that they would not show up to vote. And without their votes, the votes just weren't there for this bill to pass. Again, a very, very controversial bill. It would have let political parties send activists to film inside polling stations. Supporters of the bill, Sarah, claimed that it would combat alleged voter fraud, especially in the Arab sector. The opponents said that it would be intimidating voters and it would cause potential chaos. As for the debate today, it wasn't so much about the result. It was about the process. And of course, it was about playing to the cameras. So there was this headline-grabbing moment when Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister, was speaking in the plenum, and Ayman Odeh, a leading Arab Israeli lawmaker, stood up, started calling the prime minister a liar, was asked to leave the plenum, and then starts filming the prime minister using his smartphone camera, Sarah, to dramatize his opposition to the law. Again, was ultimately escorted out, but both sides got what they wanted. They got a moment for the cameras. They got the confrontation that helps both of them with their bases. Sarah, at the end of the day, this isn't as much a law as it is a television show, and again, both sides getting what they want out of this debate.
You're certainly right there, Owen. So tell me, where does this controversy go from here, and what are some of the other big stories which are potentially brewing ahead of September 17 elections?
Well, listen, Sarah, this goes where it's always been in a sense, which is into the political debate and into the election campaign. This bill was never really expected to pass, especially given the opposition of Lieberman and his party. And even had it passed, it would have faced legal challenges. It almost certainly wouldn't have been implemented. But again, it was a political football and is a political football for all of the parties to kick around, to gin up their bases and gin up their support. Again, these are emotional issues, charging that Arab Israelis are involved in voter fraud. And again, they contending that this was a matter of voter intimidation. So again, this will continue to be in the headlines, maybe not as much as it has been in the last few days, but because of the emotions surrounding this issue, it'll be there. As for other stories brewing, look, we have the fallout still from last night, those Gaza rockets that were fired, and Sarah, aimed at the city of Ashdod just as Prime Minister Netanyahu was getting up, the very moment when he was stepping to the microphone. Again, pictures that the Prime Minister did not want. But of course, security remains a wild card in the closing days of this vote. Of course, religion and state will still be an issue. Benjamin Netanyahu's corruption cases will still creep back into the headlines. And of course, Benjamin Netanyahu will want this election to be about his diplomatic resume, his relationships with foreign leaders. He's flying to Sochi, Russia tomorrow to meet with Vladimir Putin. That could help him win a news cycle. But Sarah, we've seen that it's a lot more complicated than that the best laid plans by the Prime Minister to win a news cycle can be foiled by unexpected events. So again, expect the unexpected. 6 days to go.
Certainly never a dull moment. Owen Alterman, thank you. Meanwhile, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says that he'll annex the Jordan Valley if he heads the next government. So where exactly is the Jordan Valley and why is it so important for Israel? I-24 News defence correspondent Jonathan Regev with the answers.
It may look like an empty and arid piece of land, but it's become the new star of the Israeli election campaign.
Today I'm announcing my intention to apply, with the formation of the next government, Israeli sovereignty on the Jordan Valley and northern Dead Sea.
The Jordan Valley is a long and narrow strip along Israel's eastern border with Jordan, starting just south of the Sea of Galilee, running south all the way to the Dead Sea. 52 years after the Jordan Valley was conquered in the Six-Day War, along with the rest of the West Bank, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is asking to change its status, but first he has an election to win.
There is one place where it is possible to apply Israeli sovereignty immediately after the election. If I receive the clear mandate to do so from you, the citizens of Israel.
A real policy change or just an election promise? That's the question. For the Israelis living here, however, there's no other choice.
The Jordan Valley is a strategic buffer zone between Israel, Jordan, Iraq, and Iran. Once this valley ceases to be in our hands, anyone here will pose a threat to Tel Aviv, to the heart of the country. There is no other reality but Israel's sovereignty over the Jordan Valley.
The Palestinians living here obviously have other thoughts. One of them is Saib Arikat, a Palestinian chief negotiator and a resident of Jericho.
What Prime Minister Netanyahu said about asking his people for a mandate to allow that will enable him to annex the Jordan Valley is paramount to a war crime. Annexation of occupied territories is a war crime.
Annexations, war crimes, elections and questions, and a lot of uncertainty. Come September 18th, we may be closer to knowing what is going to happen.
And finally, let's take you back now live to Ground Zero in New York, where people are marking 18 years since that horrific terror attack which changed the world.
Alexei Razuvayev,
Gregory Rita,
Sarah Ann Redheffer,
Michelle Marie Reed,
Judith Ann Reese,
Donald J. Regan,
Robert M. Regan,
Thomas Michael Regan,
Christian Michael Otto Regenhard,
Howard Reich,
Greg Reedy,
James Brian Riley,
Kevin O. Riley,
Timothy E. Riley,
Joseph Rena Jr.,
Thomas Barnes Raining,
Frank Bennett Reisman,
Joshua Scott Reese,
Karen Renda,
John Armand Rio,
Richard Cyril Rescorla,
John Thomas Resta.
Sylvia Sampio Resta.
Martha M. Reski.
David E. Reddick.
Todd H. Rubin.
Luis Clodoaldo Revilla Mir.
Edviges Reyes Jr.
Bruce Albert Reynolds.
John Frederick Rhodes.
Francis Saverio Riccardelli.
Rudolph N. Riccio.
Anne Marie Riccaboni.
David Harlow Rice.
Eileen Mary Rice.
Kenneth Frederick Rice III.
Cecilia E. Richard.
Vernon Allen Richard.
And my father, Police Officer Paul Talty, Emergency Service Truck 10. We love and miss you always.
And my brother-in-law, Michael William Lomax. Even though a lot of life has happened since that day, your legacy still lives on.